my gosh, it's been a hot minute since I published a video. Let's see if I still got it. So one of the projects I've been working on for a while now is this process of helping my team generate more documentation more easily. Because let's be honest, nobody likes creating documentation. And I think honestly, a lot of the documentation tools the world give us are terrible. Um, but I like Google Docs well enough. And so what I've promoted internally is that we just generate all of our documentation in Google Docs, and I will take the responsibility of putting it to the right place, whether it's Elation or Confluence or whatever the tool is that you use for documentation. So here's what I got. I think one of the coolest things that Google came out with in recent history for Google Docs anyway, is this idea of document tabs, where in addition to using my headings to format my document, I can, let me add some content here. Sorry, just real quick, for documentation purposes. Right. Okay, yeah, so we'll use the tabs to create a lot of content and kind of organize it all thematically in the same place. So if we're working on this, like, I don't know, user management problem, and I have maybe 3 or 4 Jira tickets and like I have a process document and an introduction document and a customer facing version of this document, all good things to have. And then I organize them into tabs. I think the only problem with tabs though is when you go to export the document, it doesn't download in tabs. I believe that's true. I haven't tested it recently. But okay, so here's my connections document. If I go to download it, oh, I don't have Word on this computer. Can I download as? Ah, man. Okay, take my word for it. The G Drive API doesn't have a way of saying download tab 1, download tab 2, download tab 3. When you download it, it just downloads everything into one document, which is kind of annoying if you want to keep these as separate documents. Like maybe I have a customer facing document and an internal tab, I should say tab. All right, so let's get to the tutorial. Yes. So what I've done is I've written an automation with a series of routes, classes, and this is the implementation script that will download all of the files and folders from my G Drive and store it in a location. And let's just look at the output real quick. So I've outputted everything to a test folder called Google V2. I've explicitly enumerated that I want to download the test automation folder, the connections folder, which is a folder. Oh no, that's a document. And then I also downloaded a document called What's New with Magic ETL with Andrea Henderson. Test automation is the name of a folder, and this is the stuff in that folder. And I can expand this a little bit more. Maybe look at, will any of these actually have words in them? This will. Okay. So this is the document from Google Drive, and let's just take a quick look at it. It's in the folder called Test Automation, What's New with Magic ETL. It's got a bunch of text, and it has a section called Additional Section that I use for testing. The tabs called Stuff goes here, and the text is test. Okay. So let's see what happens when I just download the basic file. So when I download it as HTML, the whole document, I get HTML. And somewhere in here will be some words. Okay, session notes GDoc. Where's the actual content from the document? Disaster recovery in those cases. I have span tags. Okay, I've got words. Okay, good stuff. I can take this HTML doc, and if I'm clever, I can open it up in BeautifulSoup and convert it into a Markdown document. Way more legible. Love this. Beautifully legible. But notice here, right, I have the first half of the document, which was the real thing. And then down here, I have the tab called additional section. Stuff goes here and test, right? That aligns with additional section, stuff goes here and test. But again, I would like this as two separate documents, not just all in one. I guess if you're curious, does the Markdown actually work and does it look nice? Yeah, it downloads reasonably. Okay, but this, I want this someplace else. I want that as a separate tab. And that's what my automation does, is it says, hey, let me take your content and split it into your tabs. So here's the first tab, what's the main document. Down at the bottom, the garbage has been removed, and then I have a tab or a Markdown document called additional section, and that's here. So how did we do that? In a nutshell, let me just find this phrase. I'm not scrolling forever. Okay. So here's my span tag for stuff goes here. It is a paragraph style. Here is how you can find title. Oh, where'd it go? Span with no content, a p tag, again with no content. Here. There's a p tag, so a paragraph tag with the class is equal to title. And then within that, there's a span tag. And in that span tag is the name of your tab. Now, you might not believe me, but let's assume for the sake of the conversation I'm not lying. So, okay, if I can take my Markdown document or my BeautifulSoup and I can say, hey, BeautifulSoup, find every p tag where the class is equal to title, then split it on that p tab and generate a page based off of the name of the span, that will be each document that we need to create. Okay, so those are like two pieces. One piece is how do I get Google Docs into HTML locally on my computer, web scrape, if you will. Then, how can I take that HTML file and split it into multiple documents? All right, so that's the project. So I went ahead and built a library called Domo Library Extensions. This library has some of the tools that I've interfaced with and kind of written libraries around to fit my nefarious needs. And this sample project under blog 2025-115 sync G drive shows you how to implement this, like downloading all files and folders from G drive. So my G drive is pretty sprawling, so what I've done is I've created an enum, unenumerated list of folders that I want to sync, and I have the option of manually selecting the documents that I want to sync. Okay, so I'm just showing you the contents of my enum here. Fine. The first thing we need to do is we need to handle authentication. I'll talk about how the authentication works in a moment, but the gist of it is I have a module called Google Auth. I have a class called Google Auth with a class method called generate from .env or from env. You pass in your path to the env, and in that env you'll have the key value pair for your GDoc client and your GDoc token. Now, let's not do it that way. Let's do it this way. Okay, so for your token, what the token does is like, You know when you go to a website and you're like, oh man, I don't want to register for this website, and they're like, don't worry, we got you. You can register using your Facebook account. You can register using your Google account. You can register using your XYZ account. That's OAuth, right? I think OAuth 2. And when you click on Google Auth, even though you're in like Spotify, it'll take you to a website that looks like Google. It says put your username and password, um, choose the scope, choose what your account is allowed to do, what your login is allowed to do, and then it sends it back to you. So that's this. The client, and you do have to set this up yourself. Like if you want to do this for this Google Drive sync for yourself, you have to go to Google Developer Console, right? You have to create a project. You go down and you say, hey, I want to create an API authentication. Just Google it, ha ha ha. But basically what it does is it says, what's the name of your project? And what's your client ID and secret, and this says this is how it knows which APIs to go to get your content or the content that you want access to. You might have to fiddle around with redirect URLs if you want to put this on the web, but okay. Once I have a client, I can, when if I don't have a token yet, when I run this automation, Google will say, oh, you want to connect to the Domo library testing project. Cool. What is your username and password? And then you type in your username and password and it sends you back a token. Now this token has an expiration date, which is why I'm not afraid to put this on the internet. It has an expiration date, and that token says, these are the things you clicked that I'm now able to access. So I gave you access to Google Drive, I gave you access to the ability to read metadata, and so on. The client ID and secret, yep. And then if I need to refresh using Jay Wilson's credentials, how do I go about handling that refresh process, right? And again, that's all of the stuff you typed into Google when you put in your username and password and it says, oh yeah, now you can log into Spotify. That's this in a nutshell. Cool. So what I've done is I've stored those values in my .env file, but I also have a method that allows you to just use the files themselves. Just be aware, if you're using your env client and env JSON objects, just make sure to add them to your git ignore so you don't post that on the internet like I'm doing right now. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is we want to, for this automation anyway, let's take a look at getting a folder. So again, under the Google module, I have another submodule called G Drive, which we're importing as DEGD, and it has a class called G Drive folder. And just like Domo library, most of my classes have a method called getById. So we'll say, hey, I want to retrieve, just to make this a little easier to read, I'm going to move this. This is a folder. So I'm saying,
something went wrong.
Google,
Try again in a few seconds.
Go to my enum, get the first value from the enum, and just print the value. That's all we're doing. We're getting the first value from this enum here, 1MP. 1MP. Okay, so that's the folder ID. All right, so we're saying take this folder ID and run it through the class method getById, passing in the Google Auth class that we defined up here. And remember, the Google Auth class says, how do I authenticate against Google? What it also does is it also defines a service. Now, a service says, hey, when I want to interact with Google Docs, I want to use V1 of the Google Docs API, or I want to use V2 of the Google Docs API. Google Drive has its own service. It's up to Google version 4. And Google Sheets also has its own API that does specific things. So as part of creating Google Auth, we also generate a service that allows us to interact with Google Drive. I'm not going to go into that, but I'll show you some code in a bit. All right, so this function will get an instance of the G Drive folder class called gfolder. Let's just print that. Okay, It's an async request, so it's hitting the internet, and the response back is, hey, get G drive folder. This is the ID. Its name is test automation. This is the last time the folder was modified, and it's got some other attributes as well. It is of type folder. It's got a parent. Cool. So within G folder, the G folder class, Google Drive folder class, has a method called getFiles, which will get the children or the files of the G folder. And then we're just going to print those. And remember, G Drive file is just a class that I made up, but I can see here, okay, I've got a spreadsheet. What's new with Magic ETL? I've got a document called Team Slack about Domo and Jira, Team Slack about GitHub and Notion, and so on. And then it's got URLs back to the document. Let's see if it works. Yep, sure does. Okay, so now I have a list of, or I have a Google Drive folder. It retrieves all of the Google Drives. The get files is also recursive. So if I find another folder inside this folder, get the children of that folder as well. So it will continue to loop and basically build out this network of all of your folders and subfolders. Cool. So what can I do with a Google file? So again, we're going to the gfolder.g drive files. So that is the attribute that contains the list of all of my Google Drive files. And I'm just getting the next one. So basically I'm getting this first one here, untitled spreadsheet. Maybe I won't get a spreadsheet because I haven't built out this code to work with spreadsheets. So I will add a filter that says for G file in G drive files, if it's a G drive file and mime string is equal to that. Okay. Is it and? Am I doing something syntactically? Oh, I need to close parentheses here and then not have an extra one there. Okay. Double equal sign. So all I did is I wanted to make sure that from G drive file, because it could have Google Sheets and videos and everything else, I wanted to make sure that I was pulling a document. Okay, so with this G file called, what's new with Andrea Henderson, I can do stuff with it. And we're going to come back to this in a moment. I have some utility functions. Ultimately, I have this class, G drive file, that's linking to this document. I want to be able to download that document and save it locally on my computer. But who knows what names and I've generated for this Google Doc, right? You could have emojis in the title. I need to turn it into something I can store locally on my computer. So I need to remove all special characters. I might want everything to be in snake case. I want to remove all emojis. And I want it to be a properly formatted file name. So I wrote a function called generate file name that takes the file name that you pass in as a string and just removes the unwanted stuff. Cool. I have another function called replace output folder. So one of the challenges that I was having in life is like, if I have a string of folders in Google Drive, I need to be able to create those folders. So I need to be able to, insert folder. Piece of cake, right? But what if that folder already exists? Do I insert or do I just, okay, fine, it already exists. Alternatively, what if I'm running my automation from scratch? Do I delete the folder? Do I replace the folder to make sure that, like, if I downloaded a document with a tab that was renamed, that I don't have the old tab. So I have a folder function called upsert folder, a utility function called upsert folder that will create a folder and replace it if it already exists. So delete it and then recreate the folder. I have a whole bunch of utility functions in the library under utils that you can take a look at. DEFI is the files utility. Okay. Anyway, so we're just testing that replace output folder works. And so we're saying, hey, let me run this again. In the folder called test, Google V2, create test automation, what's new with Andrea Henderson, just create that. And again, this is a clean file name that I can write onto my local drive structure as opposed to, oh, I guess I didn't put any emojis or anything. Well, this pipe symbol, that pipe symbol is not going to be there. This full stop, the dot is not going to be there because those are values that mean something that I've removed. Okay. Cool, so that's creating folders, piece cake. I have another function called split and export gdoc by tabs. Okay. The whole reason we're having this conversation is because the Google Drive API does not understand the concept of tabs and does not allow you to download one tab at a time. Super annoying. I don't know why they made that design decision, but here we are. So what are we going to do? We're going to open index.html and as a beautiful soup. If you don't know anything about BeautifulSoup, go Google it. It's a whole thing that's been around since the dawn of time. What we agreed on is the p tag, class equals title. That's how I know that I found a tab. So I'm going to split my Google Doc on this p tab. So take my soup, make it pretty, so turn it into a string, then split it on this text. Cool. That's going to be tabs HTML. So it's going to be a list of index of HTML. So I've got my first tab HTML, my second tab HTML, my third tab HTML. Now the splitter removes this text, so I need to add it back in for every tab after the first one. So that's my tabs HTML. If the length of tabs HTML is equal to 1, then what I know is that yeah, if the length of tabs HTML is equal to 1, then I know there's only one tab because maybe I haven't used multiple tabs. So I don't need to do anything else. We're fine. I can just have index.markdown. But if I have multiple tabs, then for each HTML in tabs HTML, create a soup, then generate the file name, the tab path. So what is the folder we're in, take my file name and make it something pretty. And remember here what we're doing is we're taking the first child of tab soup. And remember that's going to be the HTML file. Here we go. Come over here. Let me find my p tab, class equals title. So turn all of this into a soup and then find the first child, which is the span tag. So next soup children will find the first child. That's next is standard Python. So if you don't understand next, go Google next. But it finds the first item in a list that meets your filter criteria. I have no filter criteria, so it's just saying find the first child, which is my span tag, and then extract the text. And that becomes the name of the file that we generate. So here, under test, what's new? I take this text, run it through generate file name, and it returns that text. And so we're going to create a file called tab path. This, right? From there, we say, hey, in tab soup, remove the first instance of the the first element where the class is equal to title. So basically we're removing this content here because that's all of this content is the name of the tab. I don't want that in my document. The document is already called the thing. Okay, so that's what decompose does, is it removes the tab title. Then all we got to do is write it to disk. So take my tab path, write it, and what are we going to write down? We're going to Markdownify, which is its own library. So go Google Markdownify. Take my soup, turn it into a string, turn it into Markdown, write it to disk. Boom. And then we're done. We're not done. All we've done is downloaded a file. Like that. We've just done this part. Cool. So some supporting functions, right? The functions that actually make it work. So we're working backwards. We have a function called download G file. We're going to pass in the Google Drive file. Now, how do I get it to download it as Markdown? First thing we're going to do is we're going to upsert the folder location, the output folder. So then it's going to create the base folder of the document name. And we're going to run a method of G file called export. And what export does is it downloads index.html and index.markdown, right? Go to the Google Drive API, call, the export content button, and download it as HTML. So now we've got these two files here. Cool. Then we run the function that we just talked through, split and export the HTML into its separate Markdown files. So that's how I download the G file. To process or like even get my Google file, I need to start with my file ID, which is in my enum, right? Start with a file ID. Call get Google Drive file by ID. Run the function replace output folder, right? Because I need to clean up my Google Drive file name by running it through the file name cleaner. I need to make sure it goes to the right location. So what is the base folder that I want this guy to go to? It's not, yeah, fine, a little bit, whatever. And then call the function that we just discussed, download G file, which also runs split. Okay. Here's a sample of processing my G file, which we've gone through at length for Andrea Henderson. Good stuff. I guess, just to prove the point, let me add an emoji and see what happens. So let's see. Emoji calendar, because this was an event. I really like putting emojis in my Google Docs. I do. Call me crazy. So like here. All right. So if I run process G file, we pass in the file ID, we do the thing. Okay, so here, I'll run this. Oh, yeah, it works. Yep. But it doesn't try to put an emoji in my file name, right? Because that was removed. Good stuff. Okay, so that's how I process a Google Drive file. Relatively easy. Let's make it difficult. Let's deal with a whole folder. So I have a recursive function for dealing with a download folder, for dealing with downloading a folder. Recursive function means, right, the recursive part is I call the same function within itself. So I have a function that says, hey, if you receive Domo talks about recursive ETLs. You use the input and the output. That's kind of a recursive function. I would say not really. But here, this is true recursion in every sense of the programming term, insofar as I'm calling the function within itself. And what are we doing? All right, so if G folder does not have an attribute called G drive files, then call the function get files. And you'll remember that get files will get all of the files in that folder as well as the subfolders and the folders within that folder, right? So now I'll have an attribute called GDriveFiles. But if GDriveFiles is a list and there's nothing in it, print, hey, there's nothing in this folder, and we're done. Now, folder path is going to be the result of taking the G folder that was passed in, give me the name, and attach the base folder, right? And that's the folder we're currently in. Then, for each file in GDriveFiles of this folder, if the G file is of type gdoc, Google Doc, if it's a Google Doc, then run replace the output folder for that file and download the Google file, which again, we just talked through. So great. Now I've downloaded that file. But if it's not a Google Doc, if it's a folder, we need to do the recursive process. We need to say run recursive download folder for this guy that happens to be a folder, not a file. And then again, we're passing in the folder path as the new base path. So this updated location, I'm in a subfolder, that's my new base path. So that's recursion. If you don't understand recursion, go Google it. It's a very powerful term for dealing with nested hierarchies that you don't know how deep they are. Recursion. I wrap recursion into one function called processGfolder, where again, I pass in a folder ID, I pass in the auth object, I'm able to get my folder by ID, and once I have that folder, I can call recursive download. You might be saying, Jay, you could have probably done this all in one function. Maybe I could have, but I like this idea of having like supporting functions, download file, and process G file. And then I have download G folder and process G folder. I like this symmetry there. I tell myself it makes my code easier to read when I can break things up into like component parts and therefore name them appropriately. Because what you don't want to do is you don't want to have one function that has too many jobs. You don't want to have a function that says, hey, take a folder ID and convert it into a G drive folder and recursively download, right? Those are two separate activities, in my opinion. Okay. For me, I like to wrap everything into a main so you can see it all in one place. So imagine you skipped this entire video and you just walked in right here. So what does main do? Main says, take my base folder and assert its existence. Replace it if it's true. So again, if Google V2 already exists, delete it, blow it out of the water because I'm doing this again. I don't want any residual artifacts from the previous sync. Now you might say, but Jay, I'm doing a two-way sync instead of a one-way sync. Totally different conversation, modify the code appropriately. Okay, so the first thing we need to do, we generate our Google Auth using the Google Auth class and generate from env class method, which assumes client and token are stored in the env file. Great. Then I have my enums up top, my list of folders that I want to recursively download from, and I have my document enum that lists out individual documents that I want to download. Very cool. I have a function called processGfolder and a function called processGfile that I'm running for each enum in my enum, or each member of my enum. And all I'm doing is I'm passing symmetrical values. Folder ID is equal to the enum value, base path is the base path, and the Google Auth is equal to Google Auth. You know what I don't like though? G file. Does process G file manually automatically add in manual downloads? Says G file. Does not. Okay. So if I'm not mistaken, I need to modify this code. So process G file, I want the base folder to be os.path.join base folder and manual exports. Gather with concurrency. What does gather with concurrency mean? Async functions means that I can have code that runs asynchronously. Instead of doing one folder enum at a time, I can kick off multiple folder enums at the same time. Instead of processing one document at a time, I can process multiple documents at a time. But just to make sure I don't get throttled by Google, I'm going to set my limit to how many simultaneous API queries I can send to 10. So max out at 10 connections at a time, but wait until we're done processing all of these. It's asynchronous code process. Google it. All right. When I run this, it should delete the Google V2 folder and everything in it and slowly add stuff back in. So there we go. Okay, so it deleted stuff in test. It added manual exports, which were my 2 files that I added manually. And then it's syncing empty folder and test automation. I can just see stuff being added to it as we go along. In the folder, I've got a doc called F1. You'll notice here there's no sub stuff in it, so that tells me that there was no tab set up in this folder, whereas Confluence, Notion, also no tabs. Most of these didn't have tabs because tabs didn't exist when I wrote those documents, but we already talked about Andrea. And then I've got some code to sync it to GitHub. If you want to run code to sync your stuff to GitHub, go do the thing, but I'm not going to save stuff that has my real work stuff in it. Cool. Well, that was the tutorial. Hope you learned. Oh, I haven't talked through the classes. Oh, jeez, so much more to learn. Okay, I'm going to go through this a little faster. So the library itself was written with the way that I approach Domo library, which is to say I write a root that does the base functionality. I have a class that allows me to bundle a series of functions together, and then maybe store some attributes of interest. So here, let's really quickly talk through the Google Auth class. So the Google Auth class is using some other written by Google libraries. So I'm not getting true like down to the API level, but we're using, I created a library to wrap somebody else's library. Let me talk about generate creds from files. So this is a root function that receives a client's path, a token path, a list of scopes, a port number, and then does some stuff. So again, the way authentication works is if you pass in a token, and remember, the token says, I'm Jay Wilson. I've signed in with my username and password. I've given you permission to assume that I have the same username and password for this length of time. I've given you permission to take these actions, and I want to connect to I don't. Please tell me you're still recording. I'd be so disappointed. Okay. Anyway, has your username and password. You're gonna die. Can I pause the recording?